Started here. I'd like to welcome everybody to our August edition of Tennessee Turf Tuesdays. I'm Dr. Jim Brosnan here with you today, and I'm really excited for this Tennessee Turf Tuesday session. Many of you who have joined us this summer have participated in these. This is something that the turf team at UT put together in early 2020 as a way to deliver pesticide recertification and continuing education credits to the industry and feature ongoing work here at UT that has gone on throughout the summer. For those of you who haven't joined us before, the way these work, these sessions will start right now and will run till 12:30. Many of you are interested in pesticide credits, and you should, when you have registered for this session, you indicated your name, the state at which you operate, and the state at which you would like to have your pesticide credits assigned to. All of that stuff is automatically captured at registration and is included in the roster. And we use the roster from Zoom to submit to the various states in order to get you the pesticide credits that you are after. Be advised that Zoom will monitor you in the room. So you have now joined us. Zoom captures the time at which you've entered, and it also captures the time at which you leave. So if you'd like to get the full pesticide credit for live viewing, please stay with us for the duration of the presentation today to ensure that you get the credits that you are looking for. Those who are interested in GCSAA and STMA certification credits, as well as certified crop advisor credits, we'll talk about that at the end of the session. Today, we've got a big group, a lot of panelists here with us. Dr. John Sorochan is here. John, you want to say hi? His PhD student, Tyler Carr, is here, and Tyler's been leading research efforts in Zoysiagrass. Brandon Horvath is here. He's working in disease control in Zoysiagrass. Tom Samples is here. He works in all things in all grasses. It is just a key part of our team keeping us on task. And then we have a special guest today. Our session is sponsored by Syngenta Turf, and Lane Treadway with Syngenta is here. Thanks again for your support, Lane. Appreciate you supporting the Tennessee Turf Tuesday initiative.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity to sponsor this session and talk for a few minutes here this morning. And thanks everybody for joining us. I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce a new fungicide that we are just in the process of launching right now called Ascernity. And this is particularly appropriate for this group because it's going to be a very useful product for anybody that's managing Zoysiagrass on the golf course. As you can see here, one of the main points of focus for this new product is large patch control. So Ascernity is a premix formulation containing two different active ingredients. It contains solatinol, which is an SDHI fungicide that's new to many of us, and also difenconazole, which is the DMI component from Brisquet fungicide. So as I mentioned, solatinol is new to many of us in the turf market, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in a few minutes. But Ascernity is formulated as a soluble liquid formulation. It's labeled for use in golf course turf grasses only. And one of the nice things about the Ascernity label is the rate is nice and simple. There's one application rate on the label, 1 fluid ounce per 1,000 square feet. And the interval ranges from 14 up to 28 days, depending on the disease being targeted. Pricing and other information is being released to distributors today, and product will be available in the next few weeks, either in a 1 gallon bottle, which will cover 3 acres of turf at that 1 ounce rate, or as a 10 gallon link pack, which will cover 30 acres, obviously targeting fairway applications. With the combination of these two active ingredients, Ascernity is a very broad spectrum fungicide. It's labeled for 22 different turfgrass diseases, which is just about all of them. And I'm listing some of the major ones here, and you'll see some of our most widespread and important turfgrass diseases on the list, including things like anthracnose, brown patch, large patch, which is the topic for today, and other Rhizoctonia diseases and dollar spot as well. So let's talk a little bit more about this solatinol active ingredient. As I mentioned, this is an SDHI fungicide, and it belongs to the subclass of the SDHIs called the pyrazole carboxamides. Now, this group tends to be among the broader spectrum SDHI fungicides. Other products like Ballista also belong to this category. And solatinol certainly fits that bill. It's a very broad spectrum active ingredient, and then when you also combine it with difenoconazole, that makes a very broad spectrum combination product. Where solatinol does differentiate itself from other SDHIs is that it's particularly active against Rhizoctonia diseases, including large patch, brown patch, and the other Rhizoctonia diseases that we deal with in turf. And that's exactly what this data here shows from Jim Kearns at NC State University. Here we're looking at the sensitivity of different large patch isolates to different active ingredients for typically used for large patch control in turf. And what you see over here on the right is that solatinol is the most active ingredient, which is indicated by the fact that the sensitivity values are lower, meaning that you need less fungicide to provide effective control of those strains. You compare that to some of the QOI fungicides and even the DMI fungicides, you'll notice that there's a lot of variability from isolate to isolate, and also those isolates are in general less sensitive to the fungicide. And so this suggests that with solatinol, we're going to see very effective and very consistent large patch control from location to location. And that's exactly what we've seen in field trials over the last 5 years as we've tested Ascernity to prepare for its development. And it's performed very, very well in trials across the southeastern US and in the Midwest as well. Just looking at one particular example here, this is from 2015 to 16. This is one of the sets of trials when we had the highest large patch pressure. And you can see here in locations from Arkansas, Mississippi with Dr. Horvath in Tennessee, and also in Griffin, Georgia, extremely high large patch pressure, and Ascernity provided excellent control throughout, with your typical 2 applications in the fall and 1 application in the spring. And this picture, I think, sums it up best. And this is from the trial in Arkansas with Mike Richardson on Cavalier Zoysiagrass. And these particular pictures were taken almost 6 weeks after that single spring application was made. The app was done on April 9th. The picture was taken on May 19th. And even at this point, almost 6 weeks later, you can still see the disease stopping right on the line where the nozzle cut off. And so that, I think, really demonstrates what differentiates Ascernity from a lot of the other options that are out there for large patch control. It's the consistency and also the longevity, which comes in particularly handy during these long, cool, prolonged springs like we had this past year, when oftentimes a single application of traditional products might not be enough.
On October 12th of 2019 with Ballista at 0.7 ounces per thousand, and then was treated this spring on March 27th of 2020 with Ascernity at 1 ounce per 1,000 square feet. And all of those applications were made at a 2 gallon per 1,000 solution rate. And as you can see, there's absolutely no large patch whatsoever on this approach this year, which is probably the first time in 10 to 12 years with no patch in this location. Back here on May the 4th, 2020 at the Golf Club of Tennessee. This is our driving range tee. This is actually Zoysiagrass. And just want to show a little comparison of an area that was not treated with Ascernity and was treated with ProStar at 2.2 ounces on the same day on March the 27th of 2020. It's had the same treatment last fall. On 9/6 had ProStar 2.2 ounces per 1,000, and on October 12th, 2019 had Ballista at 0.7 ounces per 1,000. The only difference was the spring treatment, which this got ProStar instead of Ascernity, and as you can see, we had quite a bit of patch breakthrough. This has now been sprayed. Got sprayed on April the 18th for a curative rate of 3 ounces per 1,000 of ProStar, and it has kind of checked it up pretty good now at this point on May 4th, and it's starting to kind of grow through. But as you can see, we had a lot more patch breakthrough on the area that got treated with ProStar this spring as opposed to the Ascernity.
So the results that we've seen with Ascernity have been so effective and so consistent that we've modified our large patch assurance program to feature Ascernity as the #1 recommendation. With your typical 2 applications in the fall and 1 application in the spring. If golf course superintendents follow this recommended program, and if they experience unexpected breakthrough, we'll provide any product that's necessary for rescue treatment to help clean up any breakthrough. And for more information on Ascernity or the large patch assurance program, you can snap a picture of the QR code here on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, or be sure to contact your local distributor reps or your local Syngenta territory manager for more information. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lane, for sharing. It's definitely exciting to learn about a new fungicide for Zoysiagrass, because it's large patch is a big issue, as you've noted. We had one question come in while you were speaking about, has this product been tested on hardwood or woody plants? And is it uptake via roots, or is it topical, systemic, or just a foliar uptake dynamic? Can you speak to that a little bit before we switch presenters?
Yeah, sure. There is some root uptake that occurs when we're targeting soil-borne diseases like fairy ring and spring dead spot. It's not the most effective option for those root diseases, though. Foliar absorption is much more strong and complete, and that's why Ascernity really excels against some of these foliar diseases, including large patch and brown patch. No registrations at this time for any ornamental plants, so this is a turf product only at this point.
Great, thank you. And I should say to those listening, if you do have questions, you can put your questions in the Q&A box. That's a little bit easier than the chat box, particularly if we get a lot of questions, because the Q&A box will thread things together. So it's easy to see what's been answered and what hasn't. You can also make a comment or ask a question in chat, but would prefer if you could use Q&A moving forward. That would be great. And I'm sure you're going to have lots of questions, because you're going to see a lot of new information on dwarf Zoysiagrass here. John Sorochan and his PhD student, Tyler Carr, have been working on this for a while, and I'm going to let them take it away.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be doing here another Tennessee Turf Tuesday. And this is a really exciting topic because, you know, we're doing a lot of Zoysiagrass work here at the University of Tennessee. We've got Tyler Carr on as a new PhD student who started in January. So you're going to hear a lot from him. And, you know, he's living, breathing, sleeping. Everything he's doing is Zoysiagrass, from establishing golf putting greens to sports turf. So the title of today's talk is Zoysiagrass for Golf and Sports Turf and What's Possible. And you're going to hear from myself, Tyler a lot, Dr. Brosnan, and Dr. Horvath as well. And, you know, trying to not make this a, you know, zoomed out meeting. A lot of people might have Zoom overdrive, but hangovers. But so we're going to try to make it almost like a podcast as Tyler's going along and talking. We might have some interjections and stuff like that. So make it a little fluid. You know, there are several Zoysiagrasses that are recognized as species. So The most common is the japonica types, Zoysia japonica, coarser textured, more common for home lawns, some fairways, and, roughs, that type of texture. We got the Matrella types that are the finer textured species. And, these are the ones that are more of the putting green that we're going to talk about. And then there's also a hybrid Matrella in minima, Zoysia minima, which is also a variety that's been released for putting greens. So we're going to talk about those ones, but you can see there's lots of Zoysiagrasses that are out there. Some basics on the Zoysiagrasses. You compare it to Bermuda grass. I always tell my students and told them in class, Bermuda grass would come in 4th place in a 3-horse race when it comes to shade tolerance. So the Zoysiagrasses, especially the Matrella types, are definitely more shade tolerant. When I got to Tennessee, 18 years ago, Memphis was only 50% Bermuda grass greens, and now they're 100%. Nashville's the majority, Chattanooga's majority Bermuda greens now. Shade has become a big issue. So I think the shade tolerance of these Zoysiagrasses, and I know Dr. Mike Richardson at Arkansas is doing some work on this, comparing it to Bermuda grass. So there's a lot of data getting ready to be coming out on the shade tolerance, but they definitely have superior shade tolerance than the Bermuda grasses. The Matrella types are also more shade tolerant, and there's some neat work out of our Texas A&M that shows it's not salt avoidant, like you might say with a paspalum, where you can water with brackish water, but it's almost a remediation. It brings the salt and it exudes it through the stomate, so you can pick it up with clippings somewhat. Also requires less nitrogen than Bermuda grass. There's some data that's out there in the literature. Not so much we know on the putting green types, but there's definitely Zoysiagrasses as a whole. They have excellent heat, drought, pest tolerance, compared to creeping bentgrass. And, some of the weeds that come into Zoysiagrasses are a lot less pressures from poanua and things like that you might see compared to Bermuda grass at the fairway heights, at least. And then the disease susceptibility, when they converted from bentgrass greens to Bermuda grass greens in the transition zone, a lot of the courses, some of the thoughts were there's going to be less disease pressure than they have on bentgrass, but we still see a lot of diseases on the Bermuda grass at the putting green heights. So one of the things we want to look at is how do these Zoysiagrasses perform as well at those lower heights. So if we want to do a little comparison, and this is from surveying a lot of golf course superintendents, people, sales, sod producers, researchers, you can look at drought tolerance, Zoysiagrass, Bermuda grass, excellent, bentgrass, moderate. I'm not going to go through everything in detail of these, but this is a chart that kind of shows things, from moderate shade tolerance to poor in the Bermuda grass to, not as good as the bent grasses. The C3 grasses, cool season grasses are still more shade tolerant, but excellent traffic tolerance. And one of the things we've seen with our plots that we've had in now for almost 3 years is, there's no grain. We don't get any grain like we see on the ultra dwarf Bermuda grasses. So far, the disease pressure has been very minor to non-existent for some parts. It's almost impossible to make a ball mark in it. And I know Dr. Horvath has tried, from hitting some wedges into it to my grad students trying to slam golf balls into the surface. When you look at putting consistencies, the ultra dwarf Bermuda grasses have improved a lot and got nice putting surfaces. Still people prefer a lot. Golfers really like the bent grass. But what is it with the Zoysiagrasses? And that's some questions that are unknown entirely. So we're going to hopefully touch on some of that when Tyler talks about the green speeds that we've been measuring. So an overview of what we're going to talk about today is sprig establishment of Zoysiagrass putting greens, and then some putting green management of different varieties. And we'll talk about, during the sprig establishment, we'll also talk about herbicide tolerances for pre-emergence, as well as some sports turf. The sprig establishment, is important because, Zoysiagrasses in the literature showed that, slow to establish compared to Bermuda grass. Also, that was some work done by Briscoe et al. Also, the nitrogen fertility had little had no little effect on accelerating the establishment of Zoysiagrass. So you can't push it like you can with a Bermuda grass, for instance. And that was both confirmed by both Briscoe et al. And Richardson and Boyd as well. And should be noted that Richardson and Boyd, this was done on, I believe, a Japonica type sprig. So also, when is the best time to sprig these? And there's no literature showing when the best time to sprig the Zoysiagrass putting greens in the transition zone. The closest thing is Zhang et al. Again at Arkansas did some different timings of Japonica, of Meyer Zoysiagrass. So again, do these Mitrella types perform differently in cooler spring temperatures when you're sprigging it? And then how do pre-emergent herbicides affect establishment? Again, that's a void in the literature. So that's something we want to investigate.
Well, and John too, isn't that kind of part of the equation? If you were renovating, you know, say you were bentgrass greens and you were going to renovate to Zoysia, or maybe you were going to renovate out of an ultra dwarf to Zoysia, that establishment speed is going to be a function of how long your course is closed, right?
Right. That's a big deal on how long it would be done. And, you know, do you sod? What is the cost analysis? You know, that'd be an interesting thing to do as part of, we're just going to add that to your thesis dissertation there, Tyler, doing a cost analysis of time to sprig for establishment versus, you know, buying it as sod for greens, getting that done. So that's a great point, Jim. So I'm going to pass it off to Tyler here to talk about the sprig establishment studies that he's been conducting.
So for sprig establishment, we have two different studies going on this green. A pre-plant herbicide study using Prizm, which is a Zoysia Mitrella. This was planted on May 13th of this year. And you can see here where this was planted. Dr. Brosnan will discuss that here shortly. We also have a planting date by phosphorus fertilizer rate study. Again, using Prizm Zoysiagrass, we planted this on April 16th, May 13th, June 17th, and July 15th at a rate of 1,200 bushels per acre. These were lexicon treated sprigs. I need to add that. Before sprigging, we applied a pre-emergent herbicide Ronstar Flow. And also need to note that we went at 1,200 bushels per acre. That's what's been recommended to us. People have been documented to go up to 2,000 bushels per acre, and that may affect how establishment rates are. For pre-plant fertilizer, we applied a half a pound of P2O5 per 1,000 square feet using a complete starter fertilizer, and then a 1/4 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet using milorganite. For fertilizer treatments, we had a fixed weekly 1/4 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet using urea. And then we also wanted to look at how phosphorus affected establishment. We went with a half a pound of phosphorus of P2O5 every 2 or 4 weeks, and then we had a non-treated control. We were interested to look at phosphorus because, like Dr. Sorochan mentioned, there was a Briscoe paper that looked at Zoysiagrass establishment. Well, in that paper, they found that using milorganite, which has phosphorus in it, attributed to more rapid establishment. And so they inferred that additions of phosphorus could accelerate establishment. So we wanted to see how that affected establishment on our end. So a little methodology on how we planted these sprigs. Like I said, we had 4 sprigging dates. This one was in April. We planted half of the sprigs on the area and then used this brown roller on the left to flatten the sprigs and try to roll them down. We then applied the other half of the sprigs, rolled them in a perpendicular direction, and then we added sand top dressing. We added enough sand top dressing so that about half of the sprigs were below ground and half was sticking out of the ground. So what we want to determine, like Dr. Sorochan said, how fast these establish. We want to be able to see how long a course needs to be shut down while these grow in. And once we planted these in April, it took us about 6 weeks before we saw any green. And we had been told that it takes a little while before you see any top growth, but we were pretty surprised with how slow these were establishing. even 8 weeks, it's a little more green, but not really too filled in. So fast forward a couple weeks, actually, it's about 7 weeks, and you can see our current coverage values for April, May, June, and July. And April, I mean, it's 15 weeks after sprigging. We would expect it to be close to fully grown in, if not ready to play on. So we were wondering what's going on here. Why is it not ready to go? So we decided to do what we do as scientists and plot things on figures. This figure right here is green turfgrass coverage on the vertical axis and weeks after planting on the horizontal axis. Our April sprigs are the blue diamonds. Our May sprigs are the orange circles. I'm not going to discuss this very much. I just wanted to plot the June sprigs. These are the gray squares. The big take home for what we're seeing here is that our May sprigs at 11 weeks is very similar in coverage to our April sprigs at 14 weeks. And we were scratching our head wondering why this was occurring. Well, we remember that it was in East Tennessee, it was really cold in April. We had a couple frosts after we planted. And so a way that we could measure how temperature affects this establishment is by using growing degree days, which essentially is just a accumulation of average temperatures. So we decided to plot the growing degree days, or to figure the growing degree days for these dates. And we see here that they're actually pretty close. In Tennessee, or in East Tennessee here in the summer, 1 day is in anywhere from 25 to 30 growing degree days. So there's only about 2 days worth of difference between these. And that kind of helps us confirm that temperature may play a role in sprigging establishment rates. And this is something that we moving forward, we may really look into. It'd be cool to see if growing degree days can be used to model how fast these sprigs can grow in. That would be really beneficial for golf course superintendents so they can determine the optimal time to plant at their facility. And so in terms of the phosphorus additions, these pictures are from the May planting date. These are 11 weeks after planting. From left to right, we have no added phosphorus other than our starter fertilizer. We have phosphorus added at a half a pound of phosphorus, or P2O5, added every 4 weeks and then every 2 weeks. And what we see here is that it doesn't seem to matter if we put down an accumulation of a little over 1.5 pounds of P2O5 or if we put a little over 2.5 pounds of P2O5. They're very similar in coverage, but they're both significantly greater than just putting down a little over 1/2 pound of P2O5. And so there may be kind of a law of diminishing return. You may reach a threshold where you only need to apply a certain amount of phosphorus, and that's something we're interested in looking at moving forward.
Tyler, that's a great reason why when you do a study, you come up with 5 or 6 more things to start looking at afterwards. You know, when's the cutoff point maybe for the phosphorus where you don't get that point, that diminishing return, as you mentioned.
Agreed. That'd be an awesome greenhouse study to do this winter.
It also speaks to you can't push Zoysiagrass establishment as much as you might try, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I should interject here really quickly. We've had several individuals raise their hands. If you have a question, please type your question into the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer that via text. And if it is a direct question to one of the presenters, I can pose that aloud so the group can hear the answer during the transitions.
Okay, well, we've got a transition right here. We're going to have Dr. Brosnan discuss the pre-plant herbicide study using Prizm Zoysiagrass. So Dr. Brosnan?
Sure. Okay, Tyler. You know, one of the things that Tyler and I have talked about is, you know, with these grasses being so new, we really don't have a lot of data on really anything we can think about, whether it's herbicide use or fungicide response or sprigging establishment or nitrogen rates. I mean, it's kind of a whole new world with these grasses. So knowing that Tyler was going to go through the efforts of establishing large blocks at our research farm in Knoxville, the thought was, well, let's look at some pre-plant herbicide programs just to see how Prizm might respond to some of those treatments that are relative standard. So you can see 6 treatments from that test here. On the top left, in all of these images are 11 weeks after planting, and I believe this is our May sprigging date. So we're 11 weeks after a May 15th sprigging date. You can see a non-treated check on the top left. The center is Anderson's crab and goose. So that's an oxadiazole benzylide combination that's used quite a bit on greens, particularly now with goosegrass control being a hurdle that many are facing. An experimental herbicide from PVI Gordon on the right. That is a herbicide under development, hopefully to be launched here in a couple years. Ronstar Flow on the bottom left at 122 fluid ounces per acre. So that's the 3-pound rate of Ronstar. And that's going to prove to be important here in a slide or two. We included Regal Star 2 in this as kind of a negative control. So Regal Star 2 is prodiamine and oxadiazole. We wanted to have something that we thought would hurt establishment. And you can see by the photo that certainly this is well behind the check. And then we have Tower at 32 fluid ounces per acre on the bottom right. And you can move forward one slide, Tyler.
And Dr. Brosnan, didn't you say Tower had effects on Bermuda grass that weren't?
Yeah, there was some work that was done at the University of Georgia that was kind of the basis for this, that was looking at Tower during establishment of the ultra dwarfs, and it's why we included it in this test. You know, in terms of residual activity, it's going to be much shorter than some of the other actives that are included, but it is a different mode of action and can get at some different weeds that a Ronstar, for example, cannot. Now, I alluded to this earlier. So one of the things that we did, and we kind of lucked our way into this, was we ended up having 2 Ronstar rates in our statistical analysis here. On the left, this is the same photo shown earlier. This is 122 fluid ounces, the 3-pound rate of Ronstar 11 weeks after planting. And we're at about 64% coverage here using digital image analysis. On the right, this is the 80 fluid ounce rate for Ronstar. And if you look at the label, that is the rate for use during sprigged establishment. And it's 74% coverage. And I believe, Tyler, that at least on this one date, those two were statistically significant. We saw, particularly early on in our initial rating dates after planting, a real lag between these two rates, but eventually the higher 3-pound rate is catching up to that 80 fluid ounce rate shown on this slide.
Well, thanks, Dr. Brosnan.
Tyler, I've got a quick question. Were we seeing algal crust?
Yes, it looks like it.
Okay.
With how often these are irrigated.
Okay.
And Tom, you could see in some of the plots, you know, it's establishing sprigs, there's a little bit higher irrigation, and then also adding the phosphorus. You may have noticed in that study that you have a little more algae in the phosphorus plots that's what I want. The control plots, for sure.
So what
would be expected? Okay,
it wasn't any organic matter flotation or anything like that. It was basically algal crust.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Our next, we're going to move into the actual putting greens, some putting greens that we have established. And, you know, we looked at 4 new cultivars, relatively new cultivars that have been released. They're very, very new. And we want to look at, you know, lower nitrogen requirements, you know, some of the things that are anecdotal claims that are out there that really isn't in the literature of how to manage these putting green height Zoysiagrasses. But, you know, talking to a lot of superintendents and finding out the rates of nitrogen they're applying annually. You know, some of the early I can't call them ultra dwarfs, but just Zoysiagrass putting greens or diamond Zoysiagrass, then there's some of those greens out there that are probably 15, maybe close to 20 years old now. I'm not sure, but they've been out for a while, at least 15 years. But some of the claims, are that they're slower than the Bermuda grasses. These greens can be slow, and that's proven with the diamond, and I'll show some of that data. But these new varieties, they're not tested for the speed, so we're not sure what that is. And then what are some of the fungicide inputs that are necessary for this? And we'll talk about that as well when Brandon goes on. But the 4 species that we looked at are Lazer, Prizm, Trinity, and Primo. So you can see that on there. But the next, some of the studies we've done here back in 2010, had some undergraduate students do a project afterwards on my former PhD student, John Kaufman's plots, where we compared Champion, Tiff-Eagle, Sea Dwarf, and Diamond. We mowed these at 6 days a week at 125. So, about 3.2 millimeters, a little over 3.2 millimeters. And, we rolled 3 times a week and didn't roll. And you can see, there's really no difference between the Ultra Dwarf Bermuda grass putting greens. They're slightly faster than the Sea Dwarf. Obviously, rolling increases speeds. It didn't increase the speed on the Diamond Zoysiagrass, and we had speeds, 8 to 8.9, whereas the Bermuda grass greens were, 10.9 when they're rolled, 9.5. And this is the average speed from August 20th through October 10th. Again, a little bit higher mowing height that you'd maybe see people mowing some of these Ultra Dwarf Bermuda greens at 125, and the fertilizer back then was a little bit more jacked up than what we had normally seen. But these Zoysia grasses definitely didn't have the speeds.
So we're going to discuss the Zoysiagrass green that we have established here that was sprigged in July of 2018. It's 60 by 45 feet. A couple maintenance stats. It's mowed 5 times per week at 0.115 inches. It's rolled 5 times a week, so a few more times than what that study was 10 years ago. Top dressing occurs every 2 weeks, and vertical mowing occurs every 4 weeks. So the way this green is set up is that we have 2 large blocks. On the top we have Prizm, and on the bottom we have Primo. And the reason these were established is to be able to have cultivar specific studies. We're going to have a fungicide study looking at large patch in the future, and we're also going to be able to study some different herbicides for phytotoxicity. On the right, we have 6 plots of each cultivar, the cultivars that Dr. Sorochan mentioned: Lazer, Trinity, Prizm, and Primo. And the size and shape of these are where we can do putting green performance studies, specifically be able to measure ball roll distance. So one thing we wanted to determine, and Dr. Sorochan alluded to this, is how much nitrogen is required for these zoysia grasses. We've seen that zoysia grass fairways for golf courses and zoysia grass lawns require less nitrogen than Bermuda grass. So we wanted to kind of dial in what the nitrogen requirements were for putting green zoysia grasses. So we decided to apply either 1.5 or 3 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet over a course of 16 weeks, which is a typical growing season here in East Tennessee for warm season turf. So we split these applications up into 8 applications every 2 weeks. So we're applying either 0.19 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet or 0.38 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. And you can see the cultivar and annual nitrogen treatment combinations pictured on the right. So one thing we wanted to determine is how the visual quality of these grasses were affected by the treatments. And so weekly we use the Spectrum turf color meter to determine NDVI. And so you can see here is just one replication of our treatments. And our NDVI measurements are pictured at the bottom of the screen. And so what I want to point out is that Lazer at the 3 pound rate, and granted we're only about halfway through, so we've really only applied about 1.5 pounds of nitrogen to to this treatment here. But it has the highest color. Second place, we have Lazer at 1.5 pounds nitrogen per thousand for the year. And also Prizm and Primo both at the 3 pound rate. And so it is interesting to see that a cultivar is holding on to some color while still being given the lower amounts of nitrogen. And now we also have in the lowest statistical category, both Trinity at both the 1.5 and 3 pound annual rates. And then we have Prizm at the 1.5 pound rate. And so what we're seeing here is that at these low mowing heights, Trinity, regardless of which nitrogen rate we go at, is having a hard time maintaining the color and the visual quality that the other cultivars have.
And Tyler, that's one of the other things to notice. There's no Primo being applied to these plots or plant growth regulator or any GA inhibitor. And talking to different people like Eric Bauer at Blue Jack National, who has Trinity on a par 3 course that I think it's at greens, close to greens height or greens height. He's putting Primo down weekly, and for growth regulation, and he's showing that it gives it a higher quality, whereas we don't see that quality in these plots compared to the other varieties at these heights. But you can improve that by using a plant growth regulator like Trenex Spec Apple.
Thanks, Dr. Sorochan. Aside from visual quality and turf color, we wanted to determine how these treatments affected playability. And so here we can see our Zoysiagrass cultivars. Lazer is the blue diamond. Primo is the orange circle. Prizm, the gray squares, and Trinity, the green triangles. We have ball roll distance on the vertical axis in feet. And then we have our date on the horizontal axis. Our fertilizer applications that have been made are denoted by these red arrows. And so what we were seeing is starting in June, the middle of June, these grasses were resulting in some very high ball roll distances. Some of them were above 13, Lazer was almost a 14. But these were all significantly faster than, or at least Lazer was significantly faster than Trinity, even though Trinity was still pretty fast at 11 feet. But once the summer began to take hold, we noticed that there were not really any differences consistently among these cultivars. That could be that warmer temperatures resulted in just more clipping yield, or fertilizer applications over time contributing to this as well. And so what could this potentially be attributed to is our nitrogen fertility. And so we have the same setup as on the axes in this figure, except now we have our blue diamonds as our lower nitrogen rate and our red circles as our higher nitrogen rate. And these are pulled across all cultivars. But about the time we had our cultivars not showing any differences, we start to see differences from our nitrogen fertility rates, where the lower nitrogen rate is resulting in faster ball roll. And so we're really interested to see if over time we see a similar trend as we're seeing currently.
Tyler, and looking at this, speeds of 10.5 up to almost like 13, and even as we saw as 13.8, that it's kind of taking away that these Zoysiagrass putting greens are slow. Those are some pretty fast speeds, in my opinion. So, you want speeds around 10.5, in my opinion, maybe 11.5, get them up for tournament speeds, maybe a little faster. But, we're showing and seeing that we can get the speeds out of these newer varieties for sure.
I think that's right. And Tyler, if you can go back one slide, I think there's a key point here that needs to be really talked about, that, when we discuss ultra dwarfs and courses renovating to ultra dwarf Bermuda grass, one of the refrains that you hear is, well, they're too fast in the winter, right? And, I think this is a really important consideration, that as these grasses are fairly slow to come out of dormancy And even when they may be out of dormancy and show some green color, they're not actively growing. That if you're on greens that have a fair amount of undulation in them, and I know Dr. Horvath can probably comment on this a little bit more, you know, speeds of 13 or 14 on a flat surface, it doesn't take very much slope in a putting green to make that not puttable and not pinnable, where you can put a cup in the green. So I think, you know, for those listening that are thinking about renovating to these grasses in the future, and it might be 5 years out, I think you need to have a really hard conversation or hard look at some of the contouring in your greens and understand that these grasses are going to be quite slick as we transition into the growing season. Brandon, you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd just say that I think it also shows that you can, it kind of dispels the conventional wisdom that you can't get speed out of Zoysiagrass as you can, and it gives you a lot of flexibility to not get them too fast while still providing very nice, smooth putting surfaces. And so that's going to be a big issue moving forward. Tyler, can you comment? One of the questions that just popped into my head about the dry is, are you doing any verticutting or any other surface practices like regular top dressing, things like that? Because I don't think that was in the setup slide, and I think that might be important for thinking about as a superintendent how you might manage these grasses to maintain a more consistent speed over the course of the season.
Yeah, I did mention that a couple slides ago. Vertical mowing occurs monthly, and top dressing occurs every 2 weeks. And I stole something from Eric Bauer. Every time we're vertical mowing, we're actually doing that after top dressing, because
Right.
sand is very difficult to get into the canopy, and we've seen vertical mowing just anecdotally has helped.
So
Great.
Tyler, I've got a quick one. You know, when you start to think about Lazer versus Primo versus Prizm versus Trinity, this is really interesting because it seems like there's some varietal separation here. But I'm wondering, are we really getting our putting speed from the stolons? And you know, or is it, you know, we all know we're dealing with a matrix, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering if, like, the lignin content, cellulose content, if that's even a factor here in terms of green speed.
Well, it might be as you get
panel thing.
The greater fertility rates and increased growth, the lignin may end up slowing ball speeds down. But when it's pretty lean, you know, the matrix per se can end up resulting in the faster ball speeds.
Well, because I think Dr. Horvath mentioned the fact that, or maybe it was Dr. Sorochan, winter, you know, your green speeds might be excessive.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's kind of interesting there.
Well, and Tom, we're seeing some different things. You know, it's the some of the differences, and Tyler's going to go on to it, so you can probably start switching slides some, Tyler. But the puffiness of some of them,
Right.
you know, so some of them may need, you know, regular grooming, maybe like light tickling of grooming 3 times a week. And you know, we're not doing brushing or grooming, but maybe those are things and to help incorporate sand top dressing. And some varieties are going to, when we look at the true firm data, you know, require some of that maybe more regularly. So maybe it's weekly top dressing versus every 2 weeks, or less, every 3 weeks. So depending on the time of year and active growth.
Right. And yeah, to try to see how these cultivars differed in that puffiness that Dr. Sorochan was talking about is we use the Spectrum True Firm. It has a golf ball shaped missile at the bottom of it. So I use that to determine how soft or firm the greens are. And we did notice across all dates some differences among these cultivars. Prizm, so the higher the number, the softer the green is. That means that the hammer is penetrating further into the soil or into the surface. So Prizm is the softest, and you can even tell that by just walking over it. It's softer than the others. Trinity and Primo are kind of middle of the pack, and then Lazer is by far the most firm. And I also went out, and just to give you guys kind of a baseline, I went out and checked out a Bermuda grass and bent grass green with True Firm. I didn't take TDR, so we know moisture content affects firmness. But here's just a little bit of a baseline for comparison.
And you can see that the Prizm was a little bit spongier. That may be, you know, more vertical, like more grooming may be required from that versus the Lazer.
But no grain.
No grain. We haven't seen any grain in
That's
these
the
at
beautiful
all.
thing about the Zoysias,
Yes.
in my view.
You know, so is it, you know, is it too soon to tell? And I always love this. This is from Twitter back last year, early last year, from Josh Kelly down in Florida. You know, our Zoysia greens too good to be true. You know, this is what I'm thinking. Fortunately, they are too good, but they are definitely true as well. There's something when he had people going to his resort course in Florida, and they filed a complaint saying, I didn't realize they had artificial greens that we're putting on because they couldn't tell these are diamond Zoysiagrass greens at the time.
Wow. Yeah.
In this instance, but they're so dense, so fine textured that the person playing golf thought it was an artificial putting green, and so consistent and so uniform with no grain and all of that they thought it was artificial. So I thought that's pretty funny. So we're going to transition to Dr. Horvath here, a little bit of disease work and talking about some of the diseases.
So one of the, thanks, John. So one of the diseases that we've talked about today with Dr. Treadway's introduction and also the discussion of some of the grass weaknesses of Zoysia is that large patch is a major problem on Zoysiagrass. It's probably the most difficult to control disease that we have on Zoysiagrass. It's caused by a Rhizoctonia solani, not unlike the Rhizoctonia solani we see causing brown patch on bent grass. It's just a slightly different grouping of that pathogen, and it's a predominant problem on Zoysia. One of the challenges, and Dr. Treadway talked about this in his introduction with Ascernity coming out, is that it has been a very difficult and variable disease to control. It seems like you go out and try to make applications at proper timings, and sometimes you get control, sometimes you don't, and then you're left scratching your head about how do I change the program for next year. One of the big issues is that we've seen from some work from one of Mike Richardson's students that the pathogen is present year-round, even though we don't necessarily see symptoms on the surface. And that's one of the things that I think is true across the board of our warm season grasses, is that with cool season grasses, our stressful period is in the summer. So the plant slows down its growth in the summer. It's struggling to survive. And then the pathogens take advantage of that. The warm season grasses are almost the opposite. The slow period is obviously the dormancy period, and then the shoulder season in the spring and the fall going into dormancy and coming out of dormancy, where the plant growth is slower, and we might see symptoms during that time. But that doesn't mean that these pathogens aren't actively growing in the summer. And that's one of the things that we've seen across the board with warm season grasses, and certainly with Zoysias with large patches, that pathogen is actively growing and invading plants, even like right now is a perfect time of year for Rhizoctonia solani to be growing and infecting turf. And the grass is able to recuperate and recover and grow rapidly enough that we don't necessarily see the symptom development now, but come fall, we'll see those patches start to show up. And with something like large patch, you know, we're very creative when we name diseases. It's a large patch of affected turf, and that large patch starts to occur because initially it starts as a small patch and it grows outward. And in my opinion, it's likely that these large patches appear as such large patches when we start to see symptoms, because that pathogen has been growing for some time before we ever see symptom development. And one of the big questions about large patch with regards to what we're talking about today with some of these newer Zoysia grasses is how significant is large patch on very tightly mown turf? And that's an open question for right now. So you can see here the symptoms of large patch. You can see the driver for comparison. So that's about 45, 46 inches. And these patches can get quite large. And obviously, if this were to occur on a tightly mown putting green turf, this is going to be completely unacceptable. And so that's why we need to be very diligent in finding out what are the disease issues of these grasses that are designed for putting green turf. So some of the previous work that we've done on zoysia grasses, and one of the things that we wanted to try to get a handle on initially was to try to understand a little bit more about why fungicide control seems to be so variable. And so Jesse Benelli did his PhD work on this question, and so he inoculated plants of zoysia grown in the greenhouse, and then treated those plants on one of three locations, either the leaf, the sheath, or the stem of the plant, because we had this hypothesis that part of the challenge of getting good fungicide control was getting the fungicide to the location where the pathogen infects. And the pathogen typically is found in the basal part of the plant, in between the whorl of the leaves, down at the very bottom near the crown of the plant. And that's a very difficult place to get fungicides translocated to, because even if you get it watered in and the fungicide's taken up through the roots, typically that mobility is going to go to the place of most rapid growth, which is going to be the meristematic tissue, and then to the newest leaf, and then kind of translocated outward. And typically what we find when we look at a large patch infected plant is that the pathogen is kind of in between the leaves, out towards the older tissue, not necessarily way in at the younger tissue. So it's a difficult place to get fungicides translocated to. So one of the questions we had was, could we physically move those fungicides to that location? And so he inoculated the zoysia plants with the large patch pathogen, and then treated on the leaf, sheath, or stem. And then we used 4 fungicides. So we used QOI, azoxystrobin, an SDHI, flutalanyl, and then a DMI, tebuconazole. And we included chlorothalonil kind of as a negative control, thinking that, well, it doesn't typically control large patch, so let's see if in fact our hypothesis is correct, and if we get it to the right spot, then maybe it's effective, and maybe it just doesn't work. So on the next slide, I think we've got some data. And so this was our first experimental run looking at large patch severity. We're going to focus on the left. The image on the right is the photosynthetic capacity of the plant. You can see that's decreasing overall, but the plants that were treated on the sheath or the stem kind of maintain their photosynthetic capacity. And then the large patch severity, you can see on the left, on the y-axis is severity, and then days after trial initiation on the x-axis. And you can see the non-treated rapidly increases in disease. If we treat the leaf with the fungicides, that increases in disease. But you can see if we get the fungicide to the stem or the sheath of the plant, we get pretty good control of the pathogen. In the second experimental run, we saw the same exact thing. So you can see how the disease progresses. We didn't see quite the control on the second run, but you can see that the severity was greatly increased. In the first run, we were down around 80% in the non-treated. In the second run, we nearly killed every single plant that we inoculated. And then looking at specific fungicides, what we found was that you can see the non-treated in red with the disease percentages, and then looking at the different locations of putting these different fungicides, what we found was that when we got the fungicides into the sheath or the stem, we got very good control from the fungicides. And while chlorothalonil wasn't as active as the systemic fungicides like flutalanyl, tebuconazole, or azoxystrobin, it did decrease the amount of disease quite considerably when it was placed on the sheath or the stem of the plant. And that just kind of further confirms that when we get the fungicide to the proper location on the zoysiagrass plant, we're going to get good disease control. And that's Also, an open question for these tighter mown turfs. How do we make sure that we get these fungicides to where they need to go in order to give good disease control? And so this is just an image showing an example of this with the different fungicides. So you can see leaf dead, sheath and stem still alive. Go to the next slide. So the next disease that we're also kind of paying attention to with these tight greens type zoysias is dog's footprint. One of my favorite disease names. I always joke that we're very creative when we name diseases. This is more creative than most. We typically call it curvularia blight or ink spot over here in the US, but the Japanese named it Ino no Ashiado, which is dog's footprint translated, and I tend to like that common name. Mild temperatures, upper 70s, humid, wet conditions is when we typically see it. We see black to brown, small spots, usually aesthetic damage. So we see maybe a little bit of leaf blighting, some brown and black spots, but doesn't typically, destroy turf and thin it out. And we do see some indications with some of the work that Tyler's been doing from early on in the establishment phase. And then here later, we've seen some indications that there may be some varietal differences in terms of susceptibility to curvularia. And so that's an important thing. So you can see on this image, this is very typical of what we see. We see this black to brown spot, and you can see the one on the left is a little earlier in the establishment. And then as things have gotten tighter and we've increased the maintenance of the putting green area there that Tyler was talking about earlier, you can still see those brown or black kind of spots. But this is very typical of the aesthetic type damage that we see. We see these spots, they don't really thin, the leaves maybe curl and blight a little bit, and then the turf will rapidly recover, and you don't see a real disruption, but it's something that we need to pay attention to for sure. And then this is again from earlier in the establishment phase where we saw some differences. And I don't have, I had these in my archive, and this is from a couple of years ago, so I didn't have, I don't know exactly which variety the two are. I didn't have a note of that. But they are two different varieties, and you can definitely see that there may be some differences, and we've seen the same thing over the course of the spring here with some of the more recent outbreaks of curvularia that we've had.
And Brandon, we haven't seen the intensity quite as much at the lower mowing heights as we did at
Absolutely.
growing. They're a little bit higher, a lot more, I guess, susceptible host, a lot more foliage.
Yeah, you typically see that across the board on most diseases, is that we don't tend to see the severity quite as much as mowing height decreases. And that's largely due to a reduced microenvironment that's not quite as conducive, and there's less leaf tissue to degrade. And so that makes it more difficult to really ramp up an epidemic.
Right.
And that's very typical of the foliar diseases that we see across the board on all the grasses. Some of the other diseases that we're keeping an eye out for are things like spring dead spot, which we've seen in other zoysia grasses. We need to kind of be mindful of the fact that, I remember when seashore paspalum first came out, and the only disease it was going to get was dollar spot, and it was going to be a great warm season grass. And it is a wonderful warm season grass, but I think as time has gone on and we've planted more of that variety or species all over the country, we've seen that that's not in fact the case, that we do get quite a bit of disease in different things. Same thing with ultra-dwarf Bermuda grasses. Dr. Sorochan alluded to it earlier, that we see a reduction in, that there's less disease, but as time has gone on and more people plant ultra-dwarf Bermuda grasses, we realize that there are in fact a number of diseases that be concerned about, and that's true, and we need to be cognizant of that with zoysia grass and not say, oh, it gets less disease. It may very well get fewer diseases, but we need to be mindful of the fact that we don't have as widespread plantings of these grasses, and that's going to play a role in inoculum loads and things like that. that we're all becoming all too keenly aware of when it comes to diseases. With the unprecedented times that we're in now, we're all aware of viral load and things like that now that that we don't typically have to deal with unless we're in a time like we've been in. So spring dead spot's a grass or a disease that we need to be paying attention to. Pythium is certainly another one that we can see from time to time on Zoysia grasses, not terribly prevalent, but it's something that's possible. And we've also seen a couple of outbreaks of dollar spot on the putting green height Zoysia grasses, and we see that typically on Zoysia grass otherwise as well. So dollar spot could also be an issue. Again, when we see dollar spot, it's not typically a real pitting type of dollar spot like we might see in some cases on bent grasses. It's more of a foliar issue, and it's relatively easily managed. So it's something to be aware of, but it's not necessarily something that's of grave concern.
Thanks, Dr. Horvath. Now we're going to transition into sports turf. We've talked about sprig establishment for putting greens. We've talked about maintenance for putting greens. And so next we'll discuss Zoysiagrass sports turf research. There's currently limited research investigating Zoysiagrass for sports turf, and any research that there has been on the topic has been limited to Zoysia japonica. Some new cultivars, both japonica and Matrella, may be more aggressive, so that they can withhold some of the traffic that's associated with sports. And then Dr. Sorochan is going to touch on this, but Zoysia grass has lower light requirements compared to Bermuda grass, and this can be really beneficial in stadiums.
And John, before you get started, I should just let you know we've got 125 with us that had stayed longer than the hour we promised them. So if you can put on your best auctioneer voice here to get these folks to lunch, I'm sure they would appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely, Jim. Yeah, and we talked about some of the results, early results, preliminary results of some of the putting green type work. Well, our sports turf research is just getting started. So we haven't begun collecting data in initial or beginning any of the trials yet. That's happening in the next couple of weeks that Tyler is going to be doing this. But, Zoysia grass for sports turf isn't a new concept. This is pictures of, at the time, Bank One Ballpark back in the 90s. Dr. Steve Cockerham at UC Riverside was doing studies to look at what was the best grass to go into that stadium when they're building it for the Arizona Diamondbacks. Similarly, at that same time, I was doing studies when I was a grad student at Michigan State in La Plata, Argentina, for a dome stadium that they have down there, a retractable roof stadium. And we were looking at similar grasses. He was looking at Dianza, Zoysia grass, a japonica type, and diamond at the time, Matrella type, and compared them to different Bermuda grasses. And so this is Dianza Zoysia grass in the very beginning in Bank One Ballpark in Arizona. And they ended up switching to Bermuda grass because they were on a regular resodding basis anyways. And the Dianza, while it had better shade tolerance, was an earlier variety. So it's not a new concept, Zoysia in sports turf at all. Today we see it in some pretty high prominent stadiums. And I see my good friend Jonathan Teo in Singapore is on the webinar today. And this is his baby that he looks after. And this is the National Stadium in Singapore. And it originally was built pre-Jonathan being involved, but they built it and they had ryegrass, stitched ryegrass, perennial ryegrass, 24 kilometers away from the equator. Probably not a good idea with a lot of grow lights. It didn't last. It seeded, it germinated, it died. Lane, you would have been really happy because the fungicide sales for Subdue and Segway were probably out the roof, literally. And then, they switched to a Bermuda grass and then still had shade issues. And they do a lay-in-play system where they grow it in nurseries, come in, bring it in, and the Bermuda grass still wasn't great. So what you see in this picture is a japonica Zoysia grass that they've been installing and playing rugby sevens and soccer matches, professional soccer matches. And I was there last year when they had Tottenham and Juventus and I believe it was Man United and Inter Milan play. And so they played these games on the Japonica. They loved it. The surface played very well, but it's now gone another transition where they're phasing out the Japonica type and growing the Xeon, a Matrella type Zoysiagrass, because it is a preferred surface and a more stable surface, even in this high shaded stadium, low light several times because of the humidity and potential cloud covers in the stadium. So we set up a trial here, an experimental area, looking at some experimental varieties, and they're just filled in now. This is a little bit older picture, but we're looking at Xeon, like what's being done in the National Stadium in Singapore is going to be the new turf, and also in the stadium in Indonesia. We're using Pifway 419 as a comparison for Bermuda grass comparison. And we've got an experimental Matrella, because Xeon is a Matrella, but we've got an experimental that shows a lot more prolific underground growth, rhizome growth, and maybe a little bit more aggressive growth called M66. So it is not named yet. And then we've got a Japonica, which is an aggressive Japonica. So we look at these for the aggressiveness, maybe for one, wear tolerance, but maybe the recovery when it does get worn. And the experimental Zoysia is 54-9, which is developed by Dr. Brian Schwartz at the University of Georgia. So Tyler's going to be doing a lot of testing this fall and in the next couple of years on these grasses. And one of the things he's going to be looking at is the performance and athlete to surface performance, and looking at, these Zoysia grasses, as aggressive and tough as they are, I almost predict that they could almost have the traction of artificial turf. So we want to make sure that the right shoes are being worn in them so players don't get too much traction and potential lower extremity injuries. So we're going to look at athlete to surface interactions for deceleration testing of an athlete planting their foot. We're also going to look at, how the ball interacts with the surface. What about ball bounce, ball roll for soccer performance? How does that interact? And look at the different grasses and the varieties that these do and how they perform, as well as baseball. We're also going to simulate, on the left, we got a Toro Procore that we simulate football type traffic, aggressive wear. What's the limitations of wear that these can take, and how much should they recover at different times of the year? Then we got a CISIS soccer traffic simulator too. So we're going to do both, football type, soccer type wear. The football might be similar to rugby. I think rugby, 15 scrum is probably the most forces that are being applied to a surface. So we're going to be looking at some of those things. So not a lot to report on the sports turf Zoysia grasses yet, but that's probably going to be a future Tennessee Turf Tuesday as we get that data to report. But we're really excited about all of the things that we have going on. With that, I'd definitely like to thank our sponsor for today's Tennessee Turf Tuesday, Syngenta. And a lot of this work for Tyler and the construction of our plots from Carolina Green, and then Blade Runner Farms for providing all the grasses and some support for Tyler to be able to come up with this data. But yes, thank you to our sponsors, especially Syngenta, for this Tennessee Turf Tuesday.
Agreed, John. Yeah, very much, Lane. Thank you for your support of this session. I know we've got superintendents that are interested in GCSAA certification credits. I'm going to bring that on the screen now. So this is your GCSAA certification code for you to get your continuing education units from them. You can use the event approval code listed right here. I should say that if you are watching this video on YouTube, we archive all of our Tennessee Turf Tuesdays and present them on YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, when you submit your your GCSAA education points, you want to use today's event date when you do that, not the day that you watch it on YouTube, but the actual event date for this session of August 4th, and you should be all set there. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for hanging with us. I know we ran a little bit longer than our normal hour, but I thought it was a great conversation. We had a lot of information to share. Look forward to seeing everybody again. Our next Tennessee Turf Tuesday is going to be on September 1st, and Dr. Horvath and his technician, David Schell, are going to provide an overview of all the disease control work that they've been doing this summer on bentgrass, Bermuda grass, tall fescue, you name it. They're going to try to cover everything. And with that, we will see you on September 1st at 11:30. Have a good day.